I stared at the glowing screen of my smartphone. The harsh blue light illuminated the shadows of my tiny living room. The text message from my own brother sat right there in bold letters. He wrote that my daughter is just too much of a distraction. He actually typed that they need the aesthetics right for the wedding photos. My chest tightened instantly. A wave of cold panic washed over me. That panic quickly melted into a sharp realization of his ultimate betrayal. I stared at the screen. I realized my own brother was erasing us from his life. He had absolutely no idea what I was holding in my hands. I am Claire and I am 34 years old. I work as a pediatric nurse. My life revolves around 12-hour shifts and the sharp smell of hospital sanitizer. I hustle every single day to give my daughter the best future possible. I am a single mom. I wake up before the sun rises. I make her lunches and brush her hair. Growing up in my family was never easy. My brother was always the favorite. He was the prized son who received all the financial backing and praise. My parents gladly paid for his expensive out-of-state college. They handed him the down payment for his modern house. I was always viewed as the struggling mess. The smell of old books and stale dust in our childhood home always reminds me of studying alone in the corner. I sat there while they celebrated his minor achievements in the dining room. They threw parties when he got a passing grade on a simple test. They barely nodded when I graduated nursing school. My parents never saw my potential. They only saw my mistakes and my exhaustion. I spent years trying to prove myself to them. I desperately wanted them to be proud of me just once. It never happened. He got the bright spotlight and I got the cold shadows. My brother was currently planning a massive wedding. He was acting like a literal king, commanding his loyal subjects. I wasn't rich or glamorous like his future wife. I did not wear designer clothes or drive a luxury car, but I actually had something they did not expect at all from me. If you have ever felt completely underestimated because of where you started in life, then hit that subscribe button right now. I know exactly how heavy that burden feels. I want to hear your personal story in the comments below. We can share our experiences. Let us prove all of them wrong together. Click hype if you are with me on this journey right now today. The inciting text arrived just 3 hours before a mandatory pre-wedding family dinner. The atmosphere in my apartment was already tense. I was brushing my daughter's hair when my phone buzzed on the counter. The sound of that notification will forever be burned into my memory. I read his cruel words. I felt a hard knot form in my stomach. I had to gather my strength. I put on my best dress. I held my daughter's small hand. We walked into the fancy downtown restaurant together. The heavy scent of roasted garlic and expensive wine hit me instantly. The sound of clinking crystal glasses echoed loudly in the busy dining room. I spotted my family sitting at a long private table in the back. I walked over and sat down directly across from my brother. I looked him right in the eye. I did not blink. I asked him what his text message meant. He scoffed loudly. He took a slow sip of his expensive red wine. He looked at me with pure unhidden disgust. He said, "Your kid is loud and messy, Claire." He stated they are paying thousands of dollars for absolute perfection. He told me I was ruining the vibe of his big week. I felt my face flush with hot anger. He was publicly humiliating my child. He was insulting my parenting skills in front of our entire extended family. Aunts and uncles were watching us in dead silence. My parents did not defend me at all. They immediately sided with him, as they always did. My mother sighed loudly. She rolled her eyes at me. She said, "Claire, do not ruin his perfect day. Just hire a babysitter for the weekend." She said it is not that hard to figure out. My father reached into his thick leather wallet. He pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills. He tossed them across the white tablecloth with a flick of his wrist. The money landed right in front of my empty plate. He told me to take the cash and fix the problem. He said, "We do not have time for your drama tonight." They treated me like a beggar on the street. They honestly thought money could buy my silence. They expected my total compliance. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the long table. My daughter looked up at me with confused and sad eyes. I took a deep, long breath. I felt a sudden wave of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I reached out and calmly placed my hand over the bills. I slid the cash right back across the table toward my father. I smiled at them with genuine confidence. I said, "Keep your money." I told them I will not be attending your wedding at all. I looked right at my brother. I said, "And neither will your inheritance." I grabbed my worn purse off the back of the chair. I held my daughter by her small, warm hand. We walked quietly out of the crowded fancy restaurant together. We did not look back. They all just sat there. They stared at us in absolute shock. They thought I was just making a stupid, empty threat out of anger. They had absolutely no idea what I actually knew. They had no idea what was coming for them. The drive back to our small apartment was completely silent. The hum of the engine was the only sound. The streetlights flashed across my daughter's sleepy face in the backseat. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. My knuckles turned white. The betrayal stung worse than I expected. My brother had always been completely selfish. My parents had always enabled him, but attacking my child was a line I never thought they would cross. They crossed it with a smile. I parked the car and carried my daughter up the 3 flights of stairs. The smell of cheap hallway cleaner greeted us. I tucked her into bed and kissed her warm forehead. I walked into my tiny kitchen and poured a glass of cold water. My hands shook slightly as I drank. The reality of what just happened settled into my bones. I had finally stood up to them. The bridge was burned. I was entirely on my own now. I sat at my small kitchen table. I opened my heavy laptop. The screen cast a pale glow across my face. I needed to prepare for the massive storm that was about to hit. I knew my family would not let this go easily. They hated being challenged. They hated losing control over me even more. I checked my phone. The fallout was immediate and incredibly brutal. My brother had already created a separate family group chat to plan the rehearsal dinner. He intentionally excluded me from the main communication thread. A sympathetic cousin secretly sent me several screenshots of their private conversation. My brother was actively mocking my cramped apartment. He made fun of my simple lifestyle to everyone in the chat. He wrote that Claire is probably feeding her kid cheap instant noodles right now. He called me bitter and jealous. It hurt deeply to read those cruel words from my own flesh and blood. I cried quietly in my kitchen for a few minutes. I let the warm tears fall. I mourned the family I never really had. But then the sadness slowly vanished. It turned into a sharp, cold rage. I wiped my face. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I saved every single screenshot. I was done being their victim. The game was about to change permanently. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the city. The sound of cold rain tapping aggressively against my thin apartment window woke me up long before my alarm. My daughter was still sleeping soundly in the next room. I wrapped my worn fleece robe tightly around my waist and walked into the small kitchen. The stale smell of old coffee beans from yesterday lingered thickly in the damp air. I needed something strong to brace myself for the day ahead. I filled the kettle and listened to the low hiss of the water boiling. The harsh buzzing of my cell phone vibrating against the cheap laminate counter shattered the quiet morning. I looked down at the bright screen. It was a call from my parents. My stomach dropped instantly. A familiar knot of anxiety twisted in my gut. I stared at the flashing name for a long time. I knew exactly what they were going to say before I even answered. I slowly swiped the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. The loud, booming voice of my father immediately filled the small space. He did not call to check on me. He did not ask how my daughter was feeling after being so cruelly rejected. He called to threaten me. He shouted into the receiver with a terrifying volume. He stated they would cut me off entirely if I caused any more drama for the family. He told me I was acting like a spoiled brat. He demanded that I call the bride right this second and apologize for making a scene at the dinner. I held the phone away from my ear. I listened to his angry voice echo off the cracked paint of my kitchen walls. The sad reality of my existence washed over me in a bitter wave. They had never protected me in my entire 34 years of life. They were perfectly willing to throw me away to protect the perfect image of their prized son. I closed my eyes tightly. I remembered all the times they had used money to control my actions. They always held their financial support over my head like a heavy weapon. But this time was completely different. I was no longer a frightened child begging for their love. I opened my eyes. I spoke into the phone with a low and steady voice. I told him I would not apologize for protecting my own child from his favorite son. My father let out a disgusted sigh. He told me I was completely useless to them. He hung up the phone with a loud click. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a dead insect. I placed the phone back on the counter. My hands were shaking slightly. The silence in the kitchen felt incredibly heavy. I poured the boiling water over my dark coffee grounds. The bitter smell matched the dark feeling spreading inside my chest. I took a sip of the scalding liquid. I let the heat burn the back of my throat. I thought the worst of their cruelty was over. I was completely wrong. The ultimate insult arrived exactly 2 hours later. I was sitting at my small dining table checking my bank account balance. A sharp ping sound came from my laptop. It was an email notification. The sender was my brother. The subject line simply read wedding duties. I opened the message with trembling fingers. I read the words twice to make sure I was not hallucinating. Despite publicly uninviting my daughter and deliberately excluding me from all the family events, he had the absolute audacity to ask for a massive favor. He demanded that I bake 200 custom cupcakes for his luxury reception. He wanted them for free. He wrote a detailed list of his ridiculous requirements. He wanted expensive Madagascar vanilla bean cake. He wanted edible gold leaf decorations. He wanted hand-whipped buttercream frosting. He acted like I owed him my free labor just because we shared the same last name. He actually typed that it would be a nice wedding gift since I was saving so much money by not attending the dinner. The sheer arrogance of his words was suffocating. He wanted me to stand in my tiny hot kitchen for 3 days straight. He wanted me to spend my own hard-earned money on premium ingredients to feed his wealthy friends. He expected me to do all of this after he called my child a messy distraction. They wanted me to crumble under the pressure. They expected me to surrender and beg for their forgiveness by serving them on a silver platter. I did not shed another tear. I did not let out a sob. The sadness completely evaporated from my body. My emotional tone shifted entirely. I was done being the weak victim in this twisted family dynamic. I became extremely calculated and intensely focused. I refused to break down. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my pain. I minimized his insulting email. I opened the secret blue folder on my desktop. I saved his ridiculous cupcake demands right next to the cruel text messages. I downloaded the threatening voicemail my father had left the night before. I organized every single piece of evidence into clearly labeled digital files. I copied everything onto a small black USB drive. The repetitive clicking sound of my computer mouse was a comforting rhythm. The low hum of the laptop fan grounded my racing thoughts. I was quietly organizing a massive reality check for my arrogant family. I stacked the digital papers perfectly. My heart beat with a steady, confident rhythm. They thought they had won the war by bullying me into submission. They thought they could step on me forever without facing any real consequences. I smiled as I secured the USB drive in my pocket. I was finally ready to fight back with everything I had. I had spent my entire life putting their needs before my own basic happiness. I had swallowed my pride for decades just to keep the peace at holidays, but attacking my innocent daughter and demanding my free labor was the absolute final straw. I took another sip of my dark coffee. The bitter taste felt perfect. My hands were completely steady now. The old fear of my parents was gone forever. It was replaced by a cold and powerful anger. I was holding a secret that would destroy their entire perfect world. I just needed to put the final pieces of my plan into motion. I sat back in my cheap kitchen chair and stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. The cold anger in my chest was a sharp contrast to the exhausting heat I had endured just a few days prior. It was time to pull out my hidden advantage. I had spent the entire previous weekend completely alone cleaning out the massive attic of our late grandmother. Her name was Alina, and she was the only person in our family who ever looked at me with genuine respect. She lived in a massive Victorian house on the edge of the city. It was a beautiful old home with wrap-around porches and stained glass windows. After she passed away, the house sat empty and silent. The responsibility of clearing out her decades of memories fell entirely on my shoulders. It was a filthy and backbreaking chore. Naturally, the rest of the family flatly refused to do it. My brother claimed he had emergency cake tastings to attend with his demanding bride. He said the dust would ruin his expensive tailored suits. My mother said her allergies simply could not handle the decades of accumulated dirt. She preferred to sit by her pristine swimming pool and drink iced tea. My father insisted he was too busy managing his daily golf schedule at the country club. They pawned the exhausting physical labor off on me, as they always did. They thought they were punishing me by making me sort through heavy boxes of forgotten junk in a sweltering room. They viewed it as peasant work suitable only for the disappointment of the family. They had absolutely no idea they were actually handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their perfect facade. I remember the heavy smell of mothballs and dried lavender hitting my face the moment I pushed open the creaky attic door. The air up there was thick and stifling. The afternoon sun beat down on the dark slate roof tiles, turning the attic into a literal oven. The only sound was the scratching of dry tree branches against the small oval window at the far end of the room. Sweat dripped down the back of my neck as I hauled heavy cardboard boxes across the rough wooden floorboards. I spent hours sneezing and wiping grime from my forehead with the back of my dirty hand. I sorted through old sepia photographs and broken brass lamps. I packed away her fragile china teacups wrapped carefully in old newspaper. I folded her faded floral quilts and placed them into plastic bins. I was exhausted, and my muscles ached with every single movement. My knees were bruised from kneeling on the hard wood. I worked until the sun began to set, casting long dark shadows across the dusty room. I finally reached the darkest corner of the attic near the exposed brick chimney. There was a large pile of thick moth-eaten winter coats resting directly on the floor. It looked like a discarded heap of trash. I knelt down on the hardwood and began lifting the heavy wool garments one by one. The fabric felt rough against my skin and smelled strongly of damp earth and old cedar. Underneath the very last heavy black coat, my bare hand brushed against something solid and metallic. I stopped moving. I pulled the thick coat away and tossed it behind me. I saw a heavy gray metal box resting in the dark corner. It was a locked, fireproof lockbox. It was intentionally hidden away from plain sight. A thick layer of gray dust coated the lid, proving it had not been touched in a very long time. I wiped the dust away with my dirty thumb. My heart began to beat a little faster against my ribs. I knew my grandmother kept her important daily papers in a large floor safe downstairs in her home office. This hidden box felt entirely different. It felt like a deliberate and protected secret. I walked down the narrow, steep attic stairs. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. I rummaged through her old kitchen drawers until I found a sturdy flathead screwdriver with a cracked yellow handle. I climbed back up into the suffocating heat of the attic. My hands were slick with sweat. I jammed the metal tip of the screwdriver into the small keyhole on the front of the box. I twisted it with all the strength I had left in my tired arms. The metal protested with a loud metallic screech that echoed in the empty house. The lock finally gave way and snapped open. I dropped the screwdriver on the floor. I lifted the heavy lid. The rusted hinges groaned loudly in the quiet room. Inside the box were several thick manila folders containing completely untouched financial documents. I pulled out the top folder and opened it with shaking fingers. My eyes scanned the crisp white pages. I saw massive bank statements and lucrative investment portfolios that my parents had never once mentioned to me. The numbers printed on those pages were staggering. But the most shocking discovery was tucked safely at the very bottom of the metal box. It was a thick stack of stapled papers bound securely in a blue legal cover. It was a recently updated, legally binding will. No one else in our entire extended family knew this document existed. My hands began to tremble violently as I read the dense legal paragraphs. My grandmother had secretly changed everything just 3 months before she passed away. She was always sharp and incredibly observant, even in her final days. She saw right through my brother and his endless requests for cash. She knew exactly who he truly was behind his charming fake smiles and expensive designer suits. She knew he had manipulated our parents into funding his lavish lifestyle while ignoring my daily struggles. I sat down completely on the dusty floorboards and read every single word on those pages. The sound of my own rapid breathing filled the silent attic. The legal jargon was complex, but the final conclusion was brilliantly simple and devastatingly clear. She explicitly removed him from accessing her primary trust. What they didn't know was that my brother's entire extravagant wedding was being funded by a private account he didn't actually own. My parents had illegally authorized the massive withdrawals, assuming they were the sole executors of her outdated previous will. They were carelessly spending money that legally belonged entirely to me and my daughter. I sat there in the dark, dusty room, clutching the heavy papers to my chest. A slow, confident smile spread across my dirty face. The exhaustion in my muscles completely vanished. I carefully placed the original documents back into the metal lockbox. I wiped the remaining dust off the gray lid. I carried the heavy box down the stairs and placed it directly into the trunk of my car. I drove home that night with the windows down. The cool night air felt amazing against my skin. I listened to the steady hum of the tires on the empty highway. I parked my car in the small lot behind my apartment building. I carried the heavy metal box up the 3 flights of stairs. I hid it securely under my bed. I slept better that night than I had in years. Now sitting in my kitchen with my cold coffee, I felt completely empowered. I looked at the digital files on my computer screen. I looked at the blue legal cover resting on my dining table. My family thought I was a weak pushover. They thought I was an exhausted single mother who would simply obey their ridiculous commands. They thought they could demand 200 free cupcakes while publicly humiliating my innocent child. They were severely mistaken. The grandmother they thought they had fooled had actually seen every single lie. She had watched my brother manipulate his way through life. She had watched my parents blindly enable his terrible behavior, and she had quietly handed me the ultimate power to stop it. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had a plan they never saw coming. The trap was already set. All I needed to do was invite them to step directly into it. I took one final sip of the dark bitter coffee. I closed my laptop with a satisfying click. It was time to make a very important phone call to a very specific person. I pulled the thick blue legal cover closer to me on the kitchen table. I flipped to the very last page. There was a crisp business card stapled to the heavy parchment paper. The gold foil lettering caught the dim light of my overhead kitchen bulb. It read Arthur Henderson, attorney at law. He was my grandmother's retired lawyer. I remembered him vaguely from my childhood. He was a tall man with a gentle voice and sharp eyes. He was the one who drafted these hidden documents. I picked up my phone. The plastic case felt cold against my palm. I dialed the 10 digits carefully. The phone rang 3 times. The sound buzzed loudly against my ear. A receptionist answered with a professional tone. I asked to speak to Mr. Henderson. I told her it was an urgent matter regarding the estate of Aliner. There was a brief hold. A smooth jazz melody played softly through the speaker. Then a deep, gravelly voice came on the line. He said, "This is Arthur Henderson speaking." I introduced myself. I told him I had found the fireproof box in the attic. The line went completely silent for several seconds. I could hear his heavy breathing. He finally spoke. He told me he had been waiting for this exact phone call for over 3 years. He told me to come to his downtown office immediately. I grabbed my car keys and the heavy metal box. I drove into the city. The morning traffic was thick and noisy. Car horns blared around me. The smell of exhaust fumes filtered through my air vents. I did not care. My mind was completely focused on the destination. I parked in a dark underground garage. The tires squeaked loudly on the painted concrete. I carried the heavy box into the elevator. The metal doors slid shut with a solid clanking sound. I rode up to the 15th floor. I stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with dark wooden doors. I pushed open the heavy glass door to his firm. The sudden smell of rich mahogany and old parchment filled my lungs immediately. It was the scent of absolute authority and serious business. A heavy grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner of the waiting room. The sound was incredibly grounding. Every tick felt like a countdown for my arrogant family. Mr. Henderson walked out of his private office. He had silver hair and wore a sharply tailored navy suit. He recognized me instantly. He shook my hand firmly. His grip was strong and reassuring. We walked into his private office. The walls were lined with thousands of thick law books. I sat down in a plush leather chair. The smooth material squeaked slightly under my weight. I placed the metal lockbox directly onto his massive oak desk. I unlocked it with the screwdriver I brought with me. I handed him the original blue-bound will. I also pulled out my laptop. I opened the digital files. I showed him the cruel text messages from my brother. I played the threatening voicemail from my father out loud. The loud booming voice filled the quiet legal office. I showed him the demanding email about the 200 free custom cupcakes. Mr. Henderson adjusted his thick-framed glasses. He read every single page carefully. He listened to every single word of the recordings. His jaw clenched tight. The friendly demeanor completely vanished from his face. He looked up at me with deep, genuine sympathy. He also looked incredibly angry. He expressed absolute disgust at how my family had treated me and my young daughter. He told me it was the most shameful display of financial abuse and emotional manipulation he had ever witnessed in his entire career. He leaned back in his heavy chair. The leather creaked loudly. He told me my grandmother suspected my parents would ignore her final wishes. She knew they would try to steal the estate to fund her favorite grandson. That is exactly why she hid the true document. She wanted me to find it when the time was right. She wanted me to have the ultimate leverage. Mr. Henderson placed both of his hands flat on the desk. He looked me dead in the eye. He agreed to legally execute the newly discovered will without any delay. He told me we would stop the illegal bleeding of my trust fund immediately. He said we will make this right, Claire. He promised to hold them accountable for every single stolen penny. A powerful wave of relief and cold confidence washed over my entire body. I was no longer fighting this massive battle alone. I had a powerful ally. We formulated a flawless legal strategy right there in his office. Tension was building rapidly in the outside world while we plotted in the quiet room. My brother was currently bragging endlessly on social media. I pulled up his public profiles on my phone to show the lawyer. My brother was live streaming his wedding preparations. The loud, obnoxious pop music blasted from my phone speaker. The videos showed him drinking expensive champagne in a luxury tuxedo shop. The sound of clinking crystal glasses echoed from the tiny device. He proudly announced his extravagant $80,000 wedding budget to all of his followers. He posted high-resolution photos of the lavish country club venue. He posted videos of imported white floral arrangements that cost more than my entire yearly salary. He mocked people who had small-budget weddings. He called them cheap and embarrassing. He was completely unaware that a massive legal storm was rapidly approaching his perfect little world. He thought he was entirely untouchable. He believed his position, as the prized son, gave him absolute immunity from the law. He thought my silence over the last few days meant I was completely defeated. He assumed I was currently sitting in my hot kitchen, baking his ridiculous cupcakes for free. He was so deeply blinded by his own arrogance. My parents commented on every single video. They validated his terrible behavior. They praised his expensive taste. They called him a massive success. They were openly celebrating their victory using my stolen money. I watched the videos with a cold and emotionless stare. The sadness was entirely gone. It was replaced by pure calculated anticipation. I turned off the phone screen. The room went silent again. Mr. Henderson pulled out a piece of thick official stationery. He loaded it into his loud laser printer. The machine whirred and hummed as it printed a very formal legal document. He stamped it with a heavy metal seal. The loud thud of the stamp hitting the paper was extremely satisfying. It was a vague but mandatory legal summons. He sent copies via certified priority mail to my parents and my brother. The letters formally stated they needed to attend an urgent and mandatory meeting at his law office by Friday morning. He specifically worded the document to sound like a minor procedural issue. He called it a simple discrepancy with an old family property line. He knew their massive egos would prevent them from questioning it. It was the absolute perfect bait. We knew they would want to resolve any property issues immediately so they could sell the land for more wedding cash. The trap was officially set. I thanked Mr. Henderson and left the building. The afternoon sun felt warm and comforting on my face as I walked back to my car. 2 days later, my phone buzzed on my kitchen counter. It was a text message from my father. He demanded to know if I had received the letter from the annoying old lawyer. He told me to make sure I attended the meeting. He explicitly ordered me to just show up and sign my rights away quickly so they could get back to planning the rehearsal dinner. He said, "Do not cause a scene and do not bring your noisy kid." I stared at his demanding words. I felt absolutely nothing but cold resolve. I typed a very simple and short reply. I wrote, "I will be there." I sent the text. I placed the phone face down on the counter. The pieces were perfectly falling into exact place. My family grew more confident and arrogant by the hour. They genuinely believed they had completely won the war. They thought this meeting was just a minor, annoying stepping stone to their ultimate victory. They were happily preparing to celebrate their perfect weekend, while I was silently holding the executioner's axe above their heads. My brother had absolutely no clue his expensive fairy tale was coming to a brutal end. The tension was suffocating. The final confrontation was only 24 hours away. The trap was fully loaded and ready to snap shut on them all. The morning of the emergency family meeting was crisp and bright. The sky was a sharp, clear blue without a single cloud in sight. I woke up feeling completely different than I had my entire life. My chest felt light. The heavy burden of seeking my parents' approval was completely gone. I dressed carefully in a sharp black tailored blazer and dark slacks. I brushed my hair until it shone. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The tired and beaten-down single mother was gone. A cold and confident woman stared back at me. I dropped my daughter off at her elementary school with a warm hug and a kiss on the cheek. I promised her we would get ice cream after dinner. I drove into the city center with the radio turned off. The silence inside my car was peaceful. I parked in the same dark underground garage beneath the towering legal building. I walked into the grand lobby. The loud clicking of my sensible heels echoed sharply against the polished marble floors. The smell of expensive lemon floor wax filled my lungs. I rode the heavy brass elevator up to the 15th floor. My stomach did not flutter. My hands did not shake. I was a literal block of ice. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the law firm. The receptionist smiled warmly and guided me immediately into the main conference room. The room was intimidating and grand. A massive polished oak table dominated the center of the space. 12 heavy black leather chairs surrounded the wood. The smell of rich leather and old paper was thick in the cold air conditioning. A large antique grandfather clock stood in the far corner. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythmic sound was incredibly soothing to my ears. It was the sound of time finally running out for my arrogant family. I took a seat at the far end of the long table. I placed my hands flat on the cool, polished wood. I waited patiently. Mr. Henderson sat quietly in the chair next to me. He had a thick stack of blue-bound documents resting neatly in front of him. He gave me a single sharp nod of encouragement. We did not need to speak. The trap was perfectly laid out. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door to the conference room swung open with a loud thud. My family walked in. They brought a chaotic wave of loud voices and suffocating arrogance into the quiet space. My brother entered first. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive tailored suit that cost more than my car. The strong smell of his heavy designer cologne instantly overpowered the scent of the leather room. He looked around the formal conference room with a deep sneer on his face. My parents followed closely behind him. My mother wore a pristine white dress. She held a designer handbag tightly in the crook of her arm. My father wore his usual country club golf attire. They all looked incredibly smug. They walked toward the table like royalty, expecting the peasants to bow down. They did not even bother to greet Mr. Henderson. They barely looked at me. They pulled out the heavy leather chairs and sat down directly across from us. My mother sighed loudly and dropped her expensive purse onto the polished oak table. She looked at me with a condescending smirk. She said, "I am so glad you are finally being useful, Claire." She told me to just sign the stupid property paper so we can get back to planning the real important events. She actually asked me if I had finished baking the 200 custom cupcakes yet. She said the bride was expecting them to be perfect. My brother laughed a loud, obnoxious laugh. He checked his heavy gold watch. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He said, "Make this incredibly quick, because I have a premium cake tasting in exactly 1 hour." He told Mr. Henderson to just hand over the pen so I could sign my rights away. My father tapped his fingers aggressively on the wood. He demanded we stop wasting his valuable time. They honestly believed I was there to surrender a small piece of family land to fund their lavish weekend. They thought I was finally submitting to my role as the useless disappointment. They were smiling. I did not say a single word. I did not blink. I just sat up perfectly straight and stared directly into my brother's eyes. My silence made him shift uncomfortably in his seat for a brief second. Mr. Henderson stood up slowly from his chair. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not offer them coffee or water. He picked up the thick stack of blue-bound documents from the table. He did not pull out a single sheet of paper for me to sign. Instead, he walked around the massive table. He placed a thick, heavy copy of my grandmother's true final will directly in front of my brother. The heavy packet landed on the wood with a loud, solid smack. He placed another copy in front of my mother. He placed the final copy in front of my father. My father frowned deeply. He looked down at the thick legal document. He picked it up and flipped it over. He asked, "What is this garbage?" He demanded to know where the property release form was. Mr. Henderson walked back to his chair and sat down slowly. He looked at my father with absolute authority. He spoke with a voice that commanded complete obedience. He firmly asked everyone to open the document and turn directly to page 4. He told them to read the highlighted paragraphs out loud. The room fell into a dead and terrifying silence. The loud ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo off the walls like thunder. Tick, tick, tick. The only other sound in the room was the sharp rustling of crisp white pages turning. I watched their faces with intense, calculated focus. My brother scanned the dense legal text. His arrogant smirk instantly vanished from his face. The healthy pink color completely drained from his cheeks. He turned ghostly pale in a matter of seconds. His hands began to tremble violently. He stammered something under his breath. He dropped the heavy document onto the table like it had physically burned his fingers. He gasped for air. He said, "This is fake." He shook his head back and forth rapidly. He yelled that this cannot possibly be real. My mother let out a sharp, horrific gasp. She covered her mouth with her manicured hand. Her eyes were wide with pure terror. My father turned bright red with explosive anger. He slammed his large fist down onto the oak table. He pointed a shaking finger at Mr. Henderson. He screamed that this was a massive fraud. He yelled that he was the sole executor of the estate, and he controlled the money. Mr. Henderson crossed his arms over his chest. He leaned forward and stared my father down. He said it is incredibly real and legally binding in every court in the state. He explained the brutal reality to them with a voice as cold as ice. He stated clearly that my grandmother had legally left the entire multi-million-dollar estate solely to Claire and her daughter. He read the exact phrasing from page 4 out loud for the entire room to hear. The document explicitly disinherited my brother completely due to his documented history of severe financial abuse and manipulation. Mr. Henderson then delivered the final devastating blow. He informed them that every single bank account they had been illegally draining to fund the $80,000 wedding was now officially frozen. The money legally belonged to me. The massive wedding was entirely unfunded. I watched their entire perfect universe collapse into dust right in front of my eyes. The power dynamic in the room shifted completely in a matter of seconds. The heavy armor of their arrogance shattered into a million tiny pieces. I sat perfectly still. I looked at my brother. I spoke for the very first time since they entered the room. My voice was low and steady. I said, "You wanted absolute perfection for your big day." I smiled a cold, empty smile. I told him, "It looks like you are going to have to pay for that perfection yourself now." My brother just opened his mouth to argue, but absolutely no words came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound in the massive room. He desperately pulled his expensive smartphone out of his tailored jacket pocket. His hands shook so violently that he almost dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. He stared at the bright screen, his face twisted in pure agony. He realized his luxury wedding vendors were currently demanding their final payments by noon today. The catering company alone required a $20,000 deposit. The florist needed $10,000 for the imported roses. He could no longer make a single one of those transfers. The frozen accounts meant his fairy tale wedding was officially ruined. He was completely trapped by his own massive greed. Justice was finally being served cold right here in this room. The bitter smell of nervous sweat completely overpowered his expensive designer cologne. My parents desperately tried to backpedal and fix the catastrophic damage. They realized their prized son was about to face absolute public humiliation. They realized their own financial security was gone. My mother suddenly burst into loud theatrical tears. She stood up from her heavy leather chair. She reached out across the wide oak table and tried to grab my arm. She cried loud fake sobs and begged me to listen. She told me we are family and we need to stick together during hard times. She actually said they always loved me equally. I looked down at her manicured hand reaching for me. I felt absolutely nothing but cold disgust. I calmly pulled my arm away from her grasp. I did not accept her fake apology. I looked her right in the eyes and told her that family does not humiliate innocent children for aesthetics. My father tried a different tactic. He puffed out his chest and tried to use his loud, authoritative voice one last time. He demanded that we compromise like adults. He said we could split the estate evenly and forget this whole messy misunderstanding. He offered to let my daughter attend the wedding reception if I just signed the money back over to them today. The sheer audacity of his offer was almost comical. I slowly stood up from my chair. I zipped up my simple black bag. The loud sound of the metal zipper echoed perfectly in the quiet room. I looked at the three of them sitting there in their absolute ruin. I coldly packed up my copy of the documents. I completely ignored his ridiculous negotiation attempt. I turned to Mr. Henderson and thanked him for his excellent legal services. I walked toward the heavy wooden door of the conference room. My brother yelled my name one last time. He begged me not to ruin his life. I did not even turn my head around. I pushed the door open and walked out of the office with my head held high. The crisp air of the hallway felt absolutely amazing on my face. I rode the heavy brass elevator down to the lobby in total peace. My daughter's future was permanently secured. Her college tuition was fully funded. We were safe from their toxic grip forever. I was no longer the designated family punching bag. I drove away from that dark parking garage and drove straight into the bright afternoon sunlight. I never looked back at them again. They finally understood that my silence was never a sign of weakness. It was just quiet preparation for that exact moment of absolute victory. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to serve it legal papers first. Has your family ever excluded you or your kids just because you didn't fit their perfect image? Share your story in the comments below. We have all dealt with toxic relatives who care way more about superficial appearances than actual genuine love. Do not let them dim your bright light for another second. You deserve so much better than that kind of treatment. Keep standing up for yourself even when your voice shakes. Click hype to help this story reach others who really need to hear it today. If you want more stories about outsmarting the people who severely underestimated you, then hit subscribe right now. Drop a like if you loved seeing karma do its job so perfectly. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next incredible story. See you in the comments section. Stay strong out there.